The morning air over Fort Dawson sat heavy and still, the kind of quiet that settles over a military base when something important is about to happen. Flags barely moved against their poles. Gravel paths had been freshly raked. Every vehicle in the motor pool sat parked at perfect right angles, and the soldiers who crossed the training grounds did so with the exaggerated precision of men who knew they were being watched. Fort Dawson was preparing for its annual operational readiness evaluation, a 2-day review that would determine promotions, command assignments, and the overall standing of the installation among the 7 bases in its regional district. Tension hummed beneath the surface of every interaction, every roll call, every formation. Nobody wanted to be the one who caused a failure. Nobody wanted to be remembered as the weak link. And so, for most of the soldiers stationed there that Tuesday morning, their entire attention was consumed by the evaluation, by their own performance, by the invisible weight of being judged. That was precisely why none of them looked twice when a woman in her mid-60s walked alone along the perimeter of the Eastern Training Ground. Her steps unhurried, her expression calm, her eyes moving slowly across the landscape, as though she were reading something the rest of them could not see. She wore a standard-issue Army service uniform. Dark green jacket, pressed slacks, low-heeled shoes, polished to a quiet gleam. The uniform bore insignia, but they were understated, no chest full of medals, no gleaming decorations stacked in rows the way some officers wore their history like armor. She carried no clipboard. She walked with no aide beside her, no entourage of junior officers scrambling to keep pace. She was simply there, alone, moving through the base the way a person moves through a place they know completely, unhurried because there is nowhere more urgent to be. Her name was Evelyn Brooks. She had spent 34 years in the United States Army. She had commanded units in 3 different continents. She had written training doctrine that was still being used in officer education programs across the country. She had been the first black woman to reach the rank of brigadier general in her particular branch of the service, a fact that had been noted in newspapers and then gradually, inevitably, absorbed into the bureaucratic memory of the institution she had given her life to. She was 63 years old, recently retired, and she had returned to Fort Dawson at the personal invitation of its commanding officer because she had once trained him, shaped him, and turned him into the soldier he had eventually become. She was not there to be recognized. She was there because she had been asked, and because she still believed in the work. 3 soldiers noticed her from across the training field. They stood near the equipment shed on the far edge of the Eastern Quadrant, young men in their mid-20s, assigned to the base's 3rd Support Battalion. Their names were Carter, Mason, and Reed. Carter was the tallest of the 3, with a jaw cut from confidence and a tendency to speak before he had finished thinking. He had grown up in a household where authority was measured in volume, where the loudest voice won every argument, and where rank in every social context was something you declared rather than earned. Mason was shorter, quicker with words, the kind of person who turned cruelty into entertainment and called it humor. He had a gift for finding the precise angle at which a comment would land hardest, and he exercised this gift often, with the casual ease of someone who had never seriously considered the consequences of his words. Reed was neither the instigator nor the wit. He was the audience, the echo, the amplifier. He laughed when the others laughed, agreed when the others agreed, and had long since stopped asking himself whether he actually believed the things he was nodding along to. Together, they formed the kind of small social unit that sustains itself on the shared pleasure of having a target. They had been assigned to maintenance duty that morning, a task none of them considered worthy of their attention, and they had been standing near the shed door for the better part of 20 minutes, doing as little as possible while watching the base go through its evaluation preparations. It was Mason who spotted her first. He squinted across the field, tilted his head slightly, and then nudged Carter with his elbow. Carter looked. Reed looked. For a moment, all 3 of them simply observed a woman, older, alone, walking the perimeter as though she owned it. And then, almost simultaneously, the same thought formed in each of their minds, shaped by the same unexamined assumptions, the same reflexive calculations about who belongs in a place and who does not. She was black. She was older. She was a woman. She was alone. And her uniform, while perfectly pressed and correctly worn, did not carry the kind of visual weight they associated with real authority. Carter spoke first, his voice carrying the particular confidence of someone who has never been wrong in his own estimation. "You think she got that uniform at a costume store?" Mason laughed immediately, the sound sharp and practiced. "Halloween's not for another 3 months," he said. Reed grinned and said nothing, but his grin was agreement enough. Carter, emboldened by the response, straightened up and began walking toward her. What happened next took less than 4 minutes, but it would echo through the careers of all three men for the rest of their professional lives. Carter reached her first, Mason and Reed trailing a few paces behind. He planted himself in her path with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to taking up space, and he looked her up and down with a slow, theatrical assessment, the kind designed to communicate, before a single word is spoken, that the person looking does not consider the person being looked at worthy of basic courtesy. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, and the word ma'am came out wrong, too light, too quick, the kind of honorific that functions as its own insult when delivered without sincerity. "Can I ask where you're headed?" Evelyn stopped. She looked at him with an expression that was entirely, profoundly calm. Not the stillness of someone who has not understood the insult, but the stillness of someone who has heard it before many times, in many forms, from many faces, and who has long since stopped being surprised by it. She said, "I'm walking the perimeter. I do that when I arrive somewhere new." Carter tilted his head. "Right, and you're here because—" Behind him, Mason made a sound that was almost a laugh. "You looking for the film crew?" he said. "I think they moved the whole operation to the south end," Reed snorted. Evelyn turned her eyes slowly from Carter to Mason, then to Reed. She looked at each of them in turn, with the unhurried attention of someone who is memorizing details. "What are your names?" she asked. The question caught Carter off guard. He had not expected her to ask for names. That was what authority figures did, not the targets of casual mockery. But he recovered quickly, because he genuinely did not believe he had anything to be cautious about. "Carter," he said. "Mason," said Mason. Reed gave his name without thinking, his instinct for compliance overriding whatever flicker of hesitation had briefly surfaced. Evelyn nodded once, as though filing the information. "And what unit are you assigned to?" Carter crossed his arms. "3rd Support Battalion." "Why?" Evelyn did not answer immediately. She looked at him steadily, and something in her expression, not anger, not contempt, but a kind of patient, knowing quality, made Carter's certainty shift. Very slightly, in a way he could not quite explain, and so chose to ignore. Mason stepped in to fill the silence, his voice dropping into the register of someone who believes he is being helpful by stating the obvious. "Ma'am, this is a secure training installation. You need authorization to be walking around out here. Can I see some identification?" Evelyn looked at him, and then, very quietly, she smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was not a cold one either. It was the smile of someone who has just been handed exactly the opportunity they needed. "Of course," she said. "We'll get to that very shortly. And when we do, we'll find out exactly who among us should be presenting identification." Carter opened his mouth to respond, but Evelyn had already turned slightly, her gaze moving past them to something in the distance, and the expression on her face had shifted into something that none of them could quite interpret. Not anxiety, not anger, but a focused, quiet readiness, as though she had been waiting for a particular moment and it had just arrived. She had been waiting, in a sense, her entire life. Not for this moment specifically, she had not, in any conscious way, anticipated that 3 young soldiers would mistake her for an imposter, had not planned a confrontation, or rehearsed the scene. But she had spent decades navigating exactly this kind of moment, this particular species of dismissal, the reflexive underestimation that had followed her from her first day in uniform to the day she had finally, formally, hung that uniform in a closet in her home in Fayetteville. She had grown up in Birmingham, Alabama, the third of 5 children born to a schoolteacher and a postal worker. Her father had served in Vietnam, had come home decorated and quietly broken, had spoken rarely about what he had seen but had spoken often, with a conviction that bordered on the sacred, about the importance of doing one's duty. Evelyn had enlisted at 19, partly because of her father, partly because she genuinely could not imagine a version of herself who did not want to test the full extent of what she was capable of. The army had tested her. It had tested her in ways that had nothing to do with combat training, or physical endurance, or tactical intelligence. It had tested her in the quieter, more corrosive ways that institutions test the people they have not yet decided to fully accept. She had been passed over for promotions that her record made obvious. She had been assigned to administrative duties, while male officers with weaker evaluations were given field commands. She had walked into briefing rooms and watched the assumption form on people's faces before she had spoken a word, the assumption that she was the aide, the secretary, the support staff, never the one whose name was on the briefing report. She had not hardened in response to these experiences. That was perhaps the most remarkable thing about her. The thing that those who knew her best would later say distinguished her from officers who had faced similar obstacles and emerged bitter, defended, and closed. Evelyn had not become harder. She had become more precise. She had learned to read people with extraordinary accuracy, to understand in the first few moments of an encounter what a person believed about the world and about her, to know before anyone spoke whether she was in a room full of allies or adversaries, and to calibrate her response accordingly. She did not waste anger. She did not perform patience. She did not feel. What she offered, consistently and without calculation, was a kind of measured seriousness, a refusal to pretend that what was happening was not happening, combined with an equally firm refusal to let it define the outcome of any given situation. She had risen through the ranks on the strength of her tactical intelligence, her ability to train other soldiers in ways that were practical, demanding, and deeply effective, and her reputation for absolute clarity of judgment under pressure. She had been promoted to brigadier general at 51, in a ceremony that had been attended by 300 people and covered by 2 newspapers. She had cried once, briefly, in a bathroom afterward, not from joy, though there was joy, but from the strange and complicated grief of having waited so long for something she had always deserved. The sound of boots on gravel cut through the morning air with a rhythm that every soldier on the base recognized. It was not the rhythm of routine movement. It was the rhythm of command measured, deliberate, carrying in each footfall the particular weight of someone whose presence rearranges the atmosphere of a space before they arrive. Sergeant Major Williams appeared first, moving 2 paces ahead of the man who followed him, his spine perfectly vertical, his expression set to the formal blankness of a soldier performing a function. And then Colonel Marcus Hayes stepped into the Eastern training ground, and the change was immediate. Soldiers who had been moving at the casual half-speed of people between assignments came to attention without being told. Conversations stopped. Hands dropped to sides. The evaluation had given everyone's nerves an extra edge, but that was not what created the stillness that followed Marcus Hayes wherever he went. He was 47 years old, with a face that had been made angular and serious by a career that had given him very little reason for softness, and he carried himself with the specific gravity of someone who had been tested at the highest levels and had not been found wanting. He had served in 3 combat deployments. He had commanded a forward operating base in conditions that would not be fully declassified for another decade. He had been appointed commanding officer of Fort Dawson 8 months ago, and in those 8 months he had made it clear, without drama or excessive demonstration, that he intended to run the best evaluated installation in the district. He saw Evelyn from 40 yards away. He had been moving toward the equipment assessment area on the far side of the field, his mind on the evaluation schedule, on the readiness reports he had reviewed the night before, on the 17 things that required his personal attention before noon. And then his eyes found the figure standing near the shed, and everything else fell away. He stopped walking. Sergeant Major Williams, sensing the change, stopped also. Marcus Hayes stood still for exactly 2 seconds, long enough for the people around him to register that something had shifted, and then he walked toward her. Not the deliberate, purposeful walk of command, but something faster, something that carried in it the physical memory of a younger version of himself, A lieutenant who had first walked into a briefing room at Fort Bragg 22 years ago and found a woman at the front of the room who proceeded, over the following 3 months, to dismantle and rebuild everything he thought he knew about military strategy, leadership, and the kind of officer he wanted to become. He crossed the distance to where Evelyn stood in 12 seconds. Carter, Mason, and Reed were still arranged around her in their loose configuration of casual authority, and they did not, at first, understand what they were seeing. They had not yet processed the meaning of the fact that the commanding officer of their entire installation had just abandoned his scheduled route to walk quickly across a field toward a woman they had just accused of being an averti imposter. They began to understand it when Marcus Hayes stopped 3 feet from Evelyn Brooks and drew himself to full attention with a precision that had nothing performative about it. The precise, total attention of a soldier in the presence of someone he genuinely reveres. "General Brooks," he said, and his voice carried across the morning air with the particular clarity of words that matter. "It is an extraordinary honor to have you here." He saluted. The salute was impeccable, elbow at the correct angle, hand at the correct position, held for the correct duration. It was not the salute of obligation. It was the salute of meaning. Evelyn returned it with equal precision, and then she extended her hand, and Marcus took it with both of his. And there was in the gesture something that went well beyond protocol, the recognition of one person by another, the acknowledgement of a debt that cannot be fully calculated. Carter had gone completely still. Mason's expression had passed through several stages in rapid succession confusion, then the first slow dawning of comprehension, then something that was not quite fear, but was uncomfortably close to it. Reed had taken a half-step backward without realizing he was doing it. Marcus turned and looked at the three of them. His expression did not change. It remained exactly what it had been since he had approached, serious, attentive, present. But the quality of his attention had shifted. He was looking at them now, the way he looked at situations that required assessment. "Can someone tell me what's happening here?" he said. It was not a loud question. It did not need to be. The account that emerged in the next several minutes came from multiple sources simultaneously, the three soldiers themselves, stumbling and incomplete, a corporal who had been watching from 20 feet away and had heard most of the exchange, and the security footage from the 2 cameras mounted on the equipment shed, which had captured every word with the dispassionate clarity of technology that does not distinguish between what people want recorded and what they do not. Marcus listened to all of it. He did not interrupt. He did not allow his expression to communicate what he was thinking, which was a discipline he had practiced for decades, and which served him well in this moment, because what he was thinking was several things at once, some of them sharp enough that expressing them prematurely would not have served anyone's interests. What the footage showed was unambiguous. Carter's initial comment about the costume store, Mason's Halloween remark, the deliberate positioning of 3 young men in front of an older woman who had given them no cause for hostility, the request for identification delivered with the particular tone that means we don't believe you belong here, and Evelyn's responses patient, precise, entirely composed, which in retrospect bore the unmistakable quality of someone who was allowing a situation to develop because they understood that it would eventually correct itself. Marcus addressed the unit that had gathered word, had spread through the base with the efficiency that characterizes military information networks, and within 20 minutes of the incident becoming known, nearly 100 soldiers were assembled in the eastern training area. He did not raise his voice. He had long since learned that the most devastating things can be said in a conversational register, and that volume is most often the tool of people who have run out of better arguments. He stood before his assembled soldiers, and he told them who Evelyn Brooks was. He told them that she had graduated second in her class from the Command and General Staff College in a year when the graduating class had contained 112 officers, and she had been the only woman. He told them that she had served as senior training advisor to the Officer Development Program at Fort Benning for 6 years, during which time she had shaped the professional trajectories of more than 400 junior officers, among them himself. He told them that the tactical evaluation framework she had developed in 2003 was still the standard against which every readiness assessment in the Army's central command structure was measured. He told them that when he had been a 25-year-old lieutenant who believed he already knew everything worth knowing, she had sat across a table from him and taken apart every assumption he held about leadership with the precise, unsparing attention of someone who understood that the most important education is the kind that is uncomfortable. He told them that she had made him a better officer, and that she had done the same for hundreds of others, and that the woman they had decided to mock as an imposter this morning was, by any reasonable measure, among the most accomplished soldiers any of them would ever be in the same room with. Carter stared at the ground. Mason had not moved in several minutes. Reed looked as though he wanted to disappear entirely into the gravel beneath his boots. Around them, the assembled soldiers were very quiet. Marcus paused, and then he said the thing that he had been building toward since he had first understood what had happened. "What you demonstrated this morning," he said, "was not a failure of knowledge. You didn't know who General Brooks was. That's not disqualifying. What you demonstrated was a failure of basic human judgment, the kind of judgment that a soldier, in any rank, in any context, cannot afford to operate without. You looked at a person and decided, before she had said a word, before she had done a single thing to earn your contempt, that she did not belong here. And you made that decision based on things that have nothing to do with competence or character or service." He let that sit for a moment. "That is not a mistake I can afford to have in my soldiers." He stepped back, and he looked at Evelyn, and he said, simply, "General Brooks." Evelyn walked to the front of the assembled soldiers, and she stood for a moment, looking at them with the same quality of attention she had directed at Carter, Mason, and Reed, unhurried, complete, as though she were reading something. She spoke without notes, without preparation, in the direct and unadorned way that had always characterized her at her most serious. She told them that she was not there to make them feel guilty. Guilt, she had found, was a largely useless emotion. It turned inward, consumed itself, and left the person feeling worse without making the world any better. She was not interested in making anyone feel worse. She was interested in something more difficult and more durable: understanding. She told them about her first week at Fort Bragg in 1981, when she had been 22 years old, and the only woman in her training company and a sergeant had told her, in front of 6 other soldiers, that the Army didn't have a use for her kind, by which he had meant, she had understood immediately, both that she was black and that she was a woman, and that in his calculation these two facts together made her presence not just unnecessary, but offensive. She told them that she had not responded, that she had reported to her duties the next morning at 0500 and performed them to a standard that she had already decided, before she ever set foot on that base, would be above any reasonable criticism. She told them that she had continued to do this every day for 34 years, and that it had never stopped being necessary, and it had never stopped being exhausting, and she had never once stopped doing it, because the alternative of accepting that other people's limitations were her own limits, was not something she had ever been willing to consider. Then she was quiet for a moment, and then she asked Carter, Mason, and Reed to remain after the rest of the unit was dismissed. The request was made in the same tone she had used for everything else, calm, direct, carrying within it a weight that had nothing to do with rank. The 3 of them stood in the thinning afternoon light of the training ground after the others had filed away, and none of them had spoken since the assembly had ended. They had stood and listened to their commanding officer, and then to Evelyn herself lay out, with methodical clarity, the full scope of what they had done, and they had felt in succession the particular progression of emotions that attends real accountability. The first flush of defensive instinct, the gradual erosion of that defense, as evidence accumulated, the slow and uncomfortable arrival of comprehension. Carter, who was accustomed to occupying the center of every situation he found himself in, had spent the last hour on the periphery of his own story, watching himself from the outside, and he did not like what he saw. He had been wrong. Not wrong in the small, correctable way of someone who has made an honest mistake wrong. in the way that reveals something about the underlying architecture of your assumptions, the way a crack in a wall reveals the fault line in the foundation. He knew this. He could not unknow it. Evelyn looked at the three of them for a long moment before she spoke. When she did, her voice had changed slightly. Not softer exactly, but more direct, stripped of the formal register she had used in the assembly. This was not a speech. This was a conversation. "I'm not going to recommend disciplinary action," she said. "That's not why I asked you to stay." Carter looked up. Mason's expression shifted. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to think about it honestly before you answer." She looked at Carter. "When you first saw me, what did you see?" Carter opened his mouth and then closed it. He had prepared, in the last hour, a version of this answer that was careful, that acknowledged the error without fully exposing the reasoning behind it. But something in her expression, the patient, specific quality of her attention, the sense that she had heard every possible version of every possible deflection and was not interested in any of them, made the careful answer feel suddenly inadequate. "I saw an older woman," he said, "black, in a uniform that I thought it didn't look right. I thought she was—" He stopped. "I thought you weren't military," he finished. "Why?" The word landed quietly. Carter took a breath. "Because you didn't look like what I expect military to look like." Evelyn nodded, not approvingly, simply acknowledging the honesty. "And what does military look like?" The question hung in the air for several seconds. Carter had no good answer for it. He had only the answer that was true, which was that the image he had built up over years of what military authority looked like was an image that looked like himself and like the officers he had grown up seeing in movies and photographs and television programs, and that it did not look like her, and that he had never, until this moment, thought to examine why that was, or what it meant that he had never questioned it. Mason said, quietly, and without his usual performance of casualness, "I made fun of you." Evelyn turned to him. "I know. I didn't think. I know that too," she said. "That's actually the part that matters most. Not the words themselves. The fact that you didn't need to think to say them. That tells you something about where they came from." She looked at Reed, who had been silent throughout. "And you?" Reed met her eyes. "I laughed," he said. "That's all I did. Just laughed along." "That's not a small thing," she said, and her voice did not carry judgment, only precision. "The people who go along are often how the people who lead get the confidence to continue." Reed looked at his hands. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable in the way of silences that come from having nothing to say. It was the silence that comes from having too much to understand all at once, from standing at the beginning of a long recognition that has no tidy end. Evelyn gave them time in it. And then she said, "I'm going to give you an assignment. It's not punitive. It is, I believe, necessary." She told them what she wanted. They would spend the next 5 days working through the base's historical archives, speaking with veterans, speaking with retired officers who had served in the decades before them. They would document what they found. They would present it to the unit. She did not tell them what they would find. She already knew. What Carter, Mason, and Reed found over the following 5 days was not what they had expected to find, which was to say they had expected to find very little, and they found instead a density of history so complete and so unfamiliar that it altered, incrementally and irreversibly, the internal geography of what they thought they knew. They found the service record of Warrant Officer Diane Lawson, who had served as a combat medic in the Gulf War and had applied 3 times for a meritorious service commendation before receiving it on her 3rd application, and who had been passed over for promotion for reasons that were noted in her file as administrative and which closer examination suggested were nothing of the kind. They found the oral history of Master Sergeant Joseph Ngata, the son of Nigerian immigrants, who had trained 42 soldiers over 21 years, and who had been told, at the beginning of his career, by an officer whose name was still on a building at Fort Dawson, that he would never make Sergeant First Class because he didn't have the temperament for it. They found photographs and letters and unit citations, the accumulated evidence of hundreds of careers that had been pursued against the specific friction of being other than what the institution had been built to accommodate, and that had nevertheless produced extraordinary service records. They found, in short, what Evelyn had known they would find: that the history of the United States Army was, among other things, the history of people who had been underestimated and who had served brilliantly anyway, and that this history had been present all around them the entire time, and they had never looked for it because they had never thought they needed to. Reed was the first to say it out loud. On the third evening, sitting in the archive room surrounded by photocopied files. "I didn't know any of this existed," he said. Carter, who was reading through a stack of performance evaluations from the 1980s, looked up. "None of this is in the training materials," he said. "None of it." Mason set down the folder he had been holding and looked at the wall for a moment. "The sergeant that Lawson's record talks about, the one who kept blocking her commendation, his name is on the gym." Nobody said anything for several seconds. Then Reed said, quietly, "That should be different." And Carter, who had begun this week as a person who had not considered it his responsibility to question the environment he operated in, said, "Yeah, it should." By the fifth day, the transformation was not complete. Transformation of that kind is never complete in 5 days, or 5 months, or perhaps even 5 years. But something had shifted in the foundational architecture of how all three of them were thinking about the world they occupied. They had begun to see the base, the institution, the history of the uniform they wore as something more complicated than they had allowed it to be. And that complexity had made room for a kind of humility that Carter, in particular, had been resisting for most of his adult life. The presentation was scheduled for 9 in the morning. The entire unit was assembled again in the same training ground, where, 8 days earlier, Carter had approached an older black woman and made a joke about Halloween. The morning was overcast, the light flat and even, the kind of day that makes everything look equally important. Evelyn sat in the front row beside Marcus Hayes. Neither of them had told the 3 soldiers what the presentation should contain, only that it should be honest. Carter stood at the front of the assembled unit, and he held a folder that he did not open, because he had decided the night before that he was not going to read from notes. Mason stood to his left, Reed to his right. They had talked, the 3 of them, the night before, about what this morning was actually for. Not for their commanding officer, not for their records, for themselves and for the people they had wronged, and for the history they had spent 5 days learning to see. Carter spoke for nearly 20 minutes. He did not stumble. He did not perform remorse. He had run out of performance somewhere around the 2nd day in the archive room, when he had read a letter written in 1973 by a female officer to her mother, in which the officer described being told that her tactical assessment of a training exercise was incorrect, and then watching a male officer present the same assessment 20 minutes later and receive commendation for it. The letter was not angry. It was simply factual. The way Evelyn was always simply factual, and something about that factuality, the refusal to dramatize what should not have needed dramatizing in the first place, had gotten inside Carter's chest and stayed there. He talked about what they had found. He talked about Diane Lawson and Joseph Nagata and a dozen others. He talked about what it meant that their names were absent from the histories that had been given to Carter and Mason and Reed as the official version of the institution's past. He talked about what it meant that when he had looked at General Evelyn Brooks, he had seen everything except what she was. He said, at the end, in a voice that was not breaking but was carrying more weight than his voice usually carried, that he had made assumptions without asking questions and judgments, without evidence, and that he had done both of these things instantly and automatically, without needing to think, because that was how deep the assumptions ran, and that understanding how deep they ran was not the same as having removed them, but it was the beginning of something that he intended to take seriously for the rest of his career. Mason said less. He said, with the precision of someone who had always known how to find exactly the right word, and was now, for possibly the first time, using that skill in service of something real, rather than something clever, I turned someone's life into a punchline before she had opened her mouth. I did it because I could, and because I expected to get away with it, and because I'd been getting away with it my whole life. He paused. I'm done getting away with things. Reed spoke last. He was the quietest of the three, as he had always been. But his quiet this morning was different in quality from the quiet that had characterized him as an echo and an audience. I keep thinking about all the times I laughed, he said. All the times in my life, not just last week. All the times I chose the easy thing, which was going along, instead of the right thing, which was saying something. He looked at Evelyn. I should have said something. The assembly was silent, not the tense, anticipatory silence of people waiting for an outcome, but something more like the silence that follows a true thing, a moment of collective recognition that what has just been said cannot be taken back, and should not be. Evelyn stood. She walked to the front of the assembly slowly, and she stood before them, all the three soldiers and the 100 others, and Marcus Hayes, and every version of herself she had ever been, in the 22-year-old in her first training company, and the 51-year-old in her promotion ceremony, and the 63-year-old who had walked alone across this training ground 8 days ago. She did not speak immediately. She took in the assembled faces with the same calm, complete attention she had given everything, and then she spoke. Every person in this formation has made an assumption about another human being based on what they could see rather than what was true, she said. Every single one of you, including the people you report to, and the people they report to, and the people who built this institution. She paused. That is not an excuse for what happened last week. It is the context in which it happened. And context matters because without context, there is no understanding, and without understanding, there is no change, only performance. I am not interested in performances of improvement. I have seen enough of those to know that they leave the underlying problem completely untouched. She looked at Carter. What you did last week was wrong. And what you did this week, genuinely looking, genuinely finding, genuinely saying what you found that was harder. The hardest thing any person can do is look directly at the ways they have been wrong and stay in the room with what they see. She moved her gaze across the assembly. A soldier who cannot respect the people beside them is not an asset to this institution. They are a liability, not because of a regulation, not because of a policy, because everything this uniform represents depends on the understanding that the people wearing it have earned the right to that trust, not just on the rifle range, not just in the field, but in every moment of every day, including the moments when no one they want to impress is watching. She stopped speaking. The morning held the silence for a long moment. Then, Marcus stepped forward and looked at Carter, Mason, and Reed. He told them that in light of their conduct over the past week, the honest assessment, the genuine engagement, the willingness to stand in front of their unit and say plainly what they had done and what they had understood, he was not placing a formal reprimand in their records. He was, instead, assigning all three of them to the base's new Equity and Inclusion Working Group, which would meet monthly and which would have direct reporting access to his office. He told them this was not a punishment. It was an acknowledgement that they now understood something that most of the people in that working group would have to be persuaded to understand, and that kind of understanding, genuinely arrived at, was too valuable to waste. Carter looked at Mason. Mason looked at Reed. None of them spoke, but something passed between them. Some version of the recognition that the path forward was going to be longer and harder and more worth it than anything they had previously imagined for themselves. Evelyn spent the rest of that day at Fort Dawson. She reviewed the readiness assessment materials, walked through the training facilities, met with a group of junior officers who had heard she was on base and had requested 20 minutes with her, which she extended to 45. In the late afternoon, she sat in Marcus's office and drank coffee and talked with him the way they had always talked, directly, without preamble, catching up on the 23 years of institutional history that had separated them. He told her about the base, about the evaluation, about the work he was trying to do. She listened and asked questions and told him, when he asked her directly, what she thought. She did not spare his feelings, and he did not want her to. That had always been the nature of what she had given him, not approval, but honesty, which had turned out to be the only thing that was actually useful. At the end of the meeting, he stood and thanked her with the fullness of a person who means it, and she received his thanks with the particular grace of someone who has spent a lifetime being worth thanking, and who has learned that accepting it well is its own discipline. The following morning, Evelyn left Fort Dawson at 0600. She had her bag with her, and she walked across the base toward the main gate, with the same unhurried pace with which she had arrived alone, measured, seeing everything. She had expected to leave as she had arrived, quietly, without ceremony. But as she moved through the base, something happened that she had not anticipated, though she would realize later that she should have. The word had gone through the base overnight, not through any official channel, not by order or announcement, but the way real things move through communities, person to person, in the specific and vivid language of people who have witnessed something that mattered. And so, as Evelyn Brooks walked toward the gate of Fort Dawson in the early morning light, the soldiers she passed came to attention, one at a time, and then in groups. A young corporal at the equipment shed straightened and raised her hand in a salute. Two sergeants paused their conversation and stood. A platoon that was forming up for morning PT drew into attention as she passed. By the time she reached the main gate, there were perhaps 60 soldiers standing along her path, all of them at attention, all of them facing her, the salute moving down the line ahead of her like a wave. She did not speed up. She did not slow down. She acknowledged each salute with the precision she had maintained for 40 years, and her expression did not change that same steady, encompassing calm, but her eyes, if anyone had been close enough to see them, were bright with something that was not quite tears, and was not quite not tears either. The complicated emotional register of a person who has spent a career being underestimated, and who is, in this particular moment, in this particular morning light, on the receiving end of something that feels, in every fiber of a tired and knowing body, like the right thing. She walked through the gate and did not look back. She did not need to. She knew what was behind her. She had spent a lifetime helping to build it. There is a thing that happens, sometimes, when a person who has been denied their full worth for a very long time finally receives it, not just from one person or in one moment, but from the accumulated weight of many people, many moments, in a place that has historically not been generous with its recognition. The thing that happens is not vindication exactly, though there is some of that. It is not relief, though there is some of that too. It is something more like a shift in the underlying register of a long story, a change in the quality of the light that has been present throughout the same events, the same facts, the same history, seen now from a slightly different angle that makes visible what the prior angle had obscured. Evelyn Brooks had worked for 34 years in an institution that had given her enormous responsibility, and then, in various ways and at various times, treated that responsibility as an anomaly, a deviation from the expected, a thing to be managed rather than celebrated. She had served anyway. Not because she had to, not entirely because she felt she had to prove something, though that was part of it, always, but because the work itself had mattered to her. The soldiers she had trained had mattered. The tactical thinking, the institutional standards, the slow and patient work of making an organization better at what it claimed to value, all of this had mattered, and the fact that the organization had sometimes treated her badly did not change the fact that the work itself was real, and that she had done it to the full extent of what she was capable of, and that this was a thing she could know about herself clearly and without qualification. 3 young men had looked at her and seen nothing worth respecting, and then they had looked again, and then they had done something harder than looking. They had understood, not completely, not permanently, not without the work that would be required every day afterward to hold on to what they had understood, but genuinely. That was what she had given them the chance to do, and it was what she had given dozens of others over the course of her career. Not mercy, exactly, and not simply discipline, but the specific and demanding opportunity to become more than you were before you walked in the door. Carter would spend the next several years in the Equity Working Group, would become one of its most consistent voices, would years later tell a group of new recruits the full story of what had happened to him at Fort Dawson, in a way that cost him something each time, and that he told anyway, because he had come to understand that the stories that cost something are the ones most worth telling. Mason would find, over time, that the skill he had always possessed the ability to locate the precise word. The exact angle of an idea served him better as a tool of clarity than as a weapon of ridicule, and that the former left him with something at the end of the day that the latter never had. Reed would be the quietest of the three for the rest of his career, but his quiet would carry a different weight. From then on, the weight of someone who had decided, after a specific and remembered morning in the eastern training ground of Fort Dawson, that going along was no longer a path available to him. The soldiers at Fort Dawson would remember Evelyn's visit for a long time. Some of them would tell the story differently as the years passed, would add details or lose them, would interpret what they had witnessed through whatever understanding they had developed in the intervening time. But the essential thing, the image of 60 soldiers standing in the early morning light, arms raised in a salute, that was given not because a regulation demanded it, but because a life had been lived that demanded it, that image would hold. Marcus Hayes would be evaluated that same week, and Fort Dawson would receive the highest readiness score in its district for the second consecutive year. He would receive a commendation. He would, in his acceptance remarks, mention Evelyn's name and say that the best thing he could claim about his command was that it had been shaped by someone who understood the difference between authority that is performed and authority that is earned, and that he had been trying every day since she had first taught him that distinction 23 years ago to deserve it. Evelyn would hear about the commendation from a colleague 3 weeks later. She would read the remarks in a transcript someone forwarded to her. She would fold the paper and set it on her desk in her home in Fayetteville, where it would sit next to a photograph of her father in his Army uniform, a young man in 1968, holding his hat in both hands, squinting slightly against a sun that had been shining in a world that had not yet made room for everything he deserved. She would look at the photograph for a long moment, as she did sometimes, with the complicated tenderness of a person who understands both what was lost and what was built from what remained. And then she would go about her day, because there was still work to do, and she had never once in her life needed to wait for permission to do it. You cannot know from the outside what a person has carried, and what they have built from it, and what they have given away in the building. You cannot know this from looking. You can choose, at any moment, to begin asking.